Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we're going to hear about the books Kiss Daddy Goodnight and Rocking the Cradle of Sexual Politics, What Happened When Women Said Incest by Louise Armstrong. It's being discussed by Sheila Jeffreys and Dorothea Annison. So welcome and over to you two.
Thanks, Jo. I am very pleased to be looking at these two books on father rape today by Louise Armstrong, because I think they're very important, and what she's talking about is really relevant today. And we might get a chance to think about what's happening right now in terms of feminists and the way this sort of child rape is being looked at. I am delighted too to be discussing them with Dorothea Annison, with whom I do enjoy working. So that's lovely. Now, the two books are about what is traditionally called incest, but more usually now by feminists, father rape. I don't think there's a good term because, of course, it's more than just fathers. There's all kinds of men in families, and particularly stepfathers and stepbrothers, who are raping children in the family. It all tends to be lumped under child sexual abuse, but I think there are very different features for this kind of rape within the family in which children are imprisoned. And I don't think we have a good language for it. So the first book, Kiss Daddy Goodnight, A Speak Out on Incest, it's called. And it was the first book I ever read by a feminist on incest. It was published in 1978 and consists of both her own story of sexual assault by her father and that of many of the well over 100 women who responded to a request for women's accounts that she placed in feminist media in the US at the time. So that's the first book, 1978. And then the second one, could we have the first slide, Jo? The second one, Rocking the Cradle of Sexual Politics, What Happened When Women Said Incest. And this quote is from the introduction, saying, what the book is about. And she says, how then did we get from there when there was an enormous fuss about incest happening within feminism and within public and media and so on? How, in just 14 years, did we go from total silence, from what was said to be a dread taboo, to mothers gagged by the courts, mothers jailed, child credibility again challenged, even adult survivor credibility impugned? How did we get from forced secrecy, the suppression of children's experiences, women's experiences, such that they were not even heard, to a level of cacophony, such that children's voices, women's voices, are once more not, in any purposeful sense, being heard? So let's go over to Dorothea to get your first reactions to the books.
Well, but the books were new to me. I hadn't really been aware of them before, but I'm glad Sheila asked me to take part and read them because I have got a lot out of doing it. I do admit that Kiss Daddy Goodnight was a bit difficult to read, given that it's a series of accounts of women experiencing or girls experiencing male violence and assault. But I absolutely understand how important it was to document that and make more people aware of what was happening. But I mean, I came to feminism a few years later in the 1980s, and there was more British stuff and more feminist stuff around at the time. But what Armstrong says in her book is that sharing the stories of abuse should be the start and not the end of feminist action against rape. And so the follow-on book is, looking at why it wasn't enough, why it's not an end in itself. And that book I really found very interesting, and I would recommend it, although it's still dealing with difficult topics. She is able to do it in a easy to read and ironic, sarcastic manner. And I knew some of the stories of what she was telling about that men's rights activist backlash against women. But I found it all, it was nice to have it all brought together. There was things I didn't know, and it was very illuminating. So yeah, I would recommend the book if you can get it. I got it cheap on eBay if you're in Britain. So back to Sheila.
Thanks, Dorothy. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is talk about do a bit of background on where the first book came from and what was happening. So I'm going to talk about the 70s and the issue of incest at that time. There was an explosion of outrage against what many were calling father rape in the feminist movement at the time it was published. I've got no books on my bookshelves earlier than 1978, but there was certainly much being written and circulated outside of actual books. I knew enough to apply to the University of Bradford to do a PhD on the topic, and I went up to start that in October 1978. So I was pretty immersed in the issue of child sexual abuse at that time. I intended to use the method of research that Louise did. I put a notice in a Leeds newspaper saying that I wanted to talk to women victims about their experiences, and 11 replied to me with accounts of what their fathers did to them, and they are still in my archive. But I didn't use their experience in the end because I found something even more extraordinary. I found in a feminist archive that there was a major campaign and writings by feminists in the late 19th and early 20th century that focused on rape of girl children and particularly father rape. So I knew nothing of that, though I was a historian and I'd done an MA on that period. So there was this extraordinary earlier campaign. The campaign included, for instance, attempts to get the rape of girl children taken seriously by the law. One feminist newspaper, for instance, had a column called Comparison of Punishments, which compared the very serious penalties imposed for the theft of a loaf by a starving person with the very minor penalties for child rape. And that was about 1911. Child rape, which was not considered serious, or the girls were seen to have brought it on themselves. And one girl was seen by a judge, she was 7 years old, as having been seductive. He said she was seductive. So the feminist campaign led to the passing of the 1908 Punishment of Incest Act. It was the first time in British history there was a punishment for this form of male violence. And the act didn't see incest as a form of male violence, of course. It punished girls and women of age who were being sexually used by men and boys, as well as the male perpetrators, as if they were equally guilty. There was no recognition of coercion or inequality. And of course, most people don't even know that act exists, I suspect, because I was once asked by a girl in an A-level class where I'd mentioned that act. She came up to me afterwards in the corridor and said, Sheila, is incest illegal? And that would have been in the late 80s. So I suspect this is still, if there is not a lot of publicity about it, what girls are thinking. So when this wave of feminism suffered a huge backlash and it faded away with the First World War, and particularly in the 1930s, the concern about incest disappeared too. It only existed because of the strength of that wave of feminism in the early 19th century. So when the fury against incest, especially father rape, arose again in the 1970s, it had to create an outrage all over again in a public and political world which had completely brushed the issue under the carpet. And I fear we are in the same situation again today. The second book here, Rocking the Cradle of Sexual Politics, What Happened When Women Said Incest, describes how a huge backlash that arose against the women's liberation movement campaign against incest buried the issue once more. Today in the UK, for instance, we have serious state investigations into child sexual abuse, but particularly of boys in schools, in the Catholic Church, because that's seen as really serious. But the concern with the issue and the investigations never venture into the home. They never mention child rape by family members. In fact, that's excluded. And in terms of the rape of girls being less seen as less significant than boys. I have got quite a bit of information about that. I think Melanie Klein, the psychiatrist back in the early 19th century, did say that rape of girls by their brothers was not necessarily a bad thing because it taught them about sex. But of course, there was general acceptance that rape of boys by their fathers or anybody else is very serious. So I'm going to go on to talk about the book Kiss Daddy Goodnight, the 1978 book. I'm not going to talk about the content particularly today. The book mostly consists of women's stories, and to the extent that there is theoretical content, I think this will probably be well known at this time, so I don't really need to go into that. But I will talk about its impact. Now, the book was a thunderbolt because it was the first. It was followed by Florence Rush's The Best Kept Secret, 1980, Elizabeth Ward's Father-Daughter Rape, 1984. In the 1970s, male violence was a hugely important issue, and feminists created mayhem for the powers of male domination by speaking out and writing about a spectrum of forms of men's violence against women. The speak out was standard form. Brave women sat behind tables, went up to microphones, and broke the silence about rape, about wife battering, and later about being abused in prostitution and porn. This was standard and effective form, and it created the basis for campaigns against all these forms of violence. In the early 70s, rape was a huge issue. First stranger rape, then wife rape. And Louise's book was subtitled A Speak Out on Incest, which shows the importance of this form of activism. It really was important, and women were very brave in doing it. Now, her later book explains that the speak out form came to be used against women as a backlash against feminism developed. So speak out was sort of turned around in a way that was against the women's campaign later on. The result of the book and the general campaign against incest by feminists at that time was that incest was a hugely important issue in not just feminist writing and organizing, but also in popular culture. Feminists set up incest survivors groups, which were numerous in the UK, where women came together to discuss their experience in supportive self-help groups. But there were also talk shows about incest, and there was a huge industry set up to therapize the survivors. And I think the figures she's got, I should have taken the figures out, but I mean, there were just massive increase in all forms of therapy to create a great industry in response to feminists speaking up about incest. But of course, nothing was done about the men. And that's why Louise wrote her second book to explain why and how the behavior of men got covered up. And no serious action to stop this form of violence took place. I'm now going to hand over to Dorothea to talk about the second book.
Thanks, Sheila. I'm going to talk about a bit more detail in what Sheila's just introduced. Can't do the book justice as usual in a short webinar, but I hope to give an overview. If you want to put the next slide up, please, Jo. So she starts rocking the cradle of sexual politics with a brief history. And she calls what was happening before the women's liberation movement the age of permitted abuse. Within a total patriarchal structure, sexual use of children was permitted and presumed. Children, like women, had historically been male property, and there had always been a greedy interest in sex with children. Traditionally, rape was a property crime. It was a violation of the rights of the father or the husband, not a violent assault on a woman or girl. And in this context, she gives examples of religious texts that say that the rape of a daughter was permissible up to the age of 3 if you were Jewish or 7 for Christians, and that then she would still be a virgin for marriage. And when religion lost its power, the denial of father rape shifted to so-called science. Freud betrayed the trust of his women patients who had told him about their abuse at the hands of their fathers. Initially, he believed them, but recanted as he couldn't face up to the implications for the patriarchal family. Instead, he told them they were fantasizing due to penis envy and had a deep unconscious desire for seduction. This fraudulent move brought in what she calls the age of denied abuse, where incest becomes the psychiatric problem of the victim, not the perpetrator. She sums it up as 1, stuff that's taboo doesn't happen. 2, if the kid says it does, it's either the kid's imagining or the kid's fault. And so in practice, incestuous assault continued to be part of the continuum of socially condoned male behaviour. She says, he simply wanted to, and nothing in the world told him he could not, should not, or must not. So then we move on to the 1970s and the feminist exposure of rape by fathers. So women were meeting in consciousness raising groups to share their experiences, to develop a political analysis of the workings of male domination. Many women found they had shared experiences of rape and abuse, that this was common, and it was happening in so-called normal families. And women were speaking out about this to end the so-called taboo and break the silence. But what they found was that the taboo was not the rape, but speaking about rape. And she reminds us that consciousness-raising groups were not about making individual women feel better. The focus was the working of patriarchy. The intention was to get evidence for political action. These feminists were demanding social change and accountability for men. So the first step, remove the secrecy. The second step, demand action to stop and reduce rape. So she says, what we were doing not only felt radical, it was radical, in the sense of unearthing a fundamental truth of women's experience with a hope for basic change. We were seeking to expose and condemn the permission for male sexual abuse of the children in their care and trust, talking and plotting the overthrow of a centuries-old secret. But if women had been listened to, that would have meant the arrest of thousands of so-called upstanding male citizens. The legal and medical establishment recoiled from this acceptance of how common incest is. Instead of arresting fathers, they looked around for someone else to blame and punish. Surprise, they get blamed the mothers. So we move on to what she calls the doctrine of equal culpability. The idea that if there is rape going on in families, it's not because of male violence, male power. It's because of dysfunctional families. There's a dysfunctional family and an incest mother that is used to explain away father rape and avoid any challenge to men. So mothers were failing in their wifely role. They were being controlling, cold, or denying sex. And this naturally led the father to turn to his daughter, who enjoyed the sexual attention. And they assumed that if a daughter did disclose being raped, the mother would deny it and stand by her man. The mother fails to protect the daughter, so the daughter is angry at the mother, not the father. I mean, this is, of course, a total, what Mary Daly calls patriarchal reversal, or what modern jargon DARVO, deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. It's a denial of male power in families, and the sexual contact is seen as harmless, and it's only awareness of the taboo that causes girls to feel guilt or shame. This obviously contradicts women's experience. They felt rage and fear, not shame or guilt, and fathers deliberately isolated girls from their mothers and threatened them if they were going to tell. The majority of mothers didn't know. She also said it actually treats men as lacking in moral agency and totally unable to control themselves. But mothers bear the responsibility for prevention and stopping the rape, even when the father is also violent and abusive to her. It's the passive and dependent wife that's in the wrong, not the dominant and controlling husband. So the next move in silencing women was the move from politics to pathology. And during the 1980s, the feminist analysis was very much sidelined. And she sets this backlash in the broader social political context of people moving away from attempts at social change to turning inwards and change themselves. It was a decade of disorders and the growth of therapy and the recovery movement. And at this point, sharing the stories of father rape and survival became an end in itself rather than a means to achieve a social and political response to male violence. And so this shifted the focus away from the male abusers to female victims. There was little attempt to punish the rapists or to do anything to stop the rape that was still happening to girls. Survivor stories became a staple of chat shows and soap operas. She calls it a media circus. But she says this produced noise, which was just another form of silencing of feminists. Because of this, father rape became an issue for social workers and therapists, not for police or judges, and women became patients, with father rape effectively decriminalised and a focus on keeping the family together. When children disclosed abuse, this was dealt with in family courts, not criminal courts, and it was more likely that a girl would be taken into care than a father put in prison. Still, no one was telling men this is wrong and they must not do it. This was the adoption of a medical model of incest and professionals replacing women as experts on their experience. And in order for this mental health ideology to win, she says that feminist analysis had to lose, but the mental health ideology was made more palatable by calling it feminist and adopting feminist language. And the next slide, please. What was really behind this was the feminist analysis of power and the family was just too dangerous. It came powerfully close to exposing male predation as the witless exploitations of a bully class. Had women at large put it together, the statistics on wife battering, the incidents of child rape, the fact that the offenders were normal men, indistinguishable from all other men, the idea that men were as likely as not dangerous to have in the house, and that you could not tell in advance which men would prove to be so, there might be a significant disincentive to family life. A need for a sense of personal safety drove a public will to collude with the definitions of incest families as other. A punitive stance requires consensus, and a substantial portion of the population remained uncertain as to just how wrong sexually violating your own child was. So the radical feminist analysis, then as now, was just too dangerous. Many women just didn't want to accept what it actually meant about their relationships with men. So the next stage she calls the age of no fault abuse. And then it's interesting that she was pointing this out in the 1990s about how claiming something is gender neutral became a key move in denying what was being done to women, which of course we're seeing very much now. Things are called gender neutral or gender neutral language like parent instead of mother, and it just obscures women's needs and our sex-based rights. And so the adoption of the medical model of incest brought in gender-neutral language like parental abuse and intrafamilial sexual assault or spousal abuse. There's no men anywhere. So as women spoke about their pain, personal and political were put into competition. I mean, some women did speak about abuse by their mothers, and that was used as a distraction. So women do it too. It's just as common. It's just even more taboo and hidden. But those women that were recorded as offenders, many, that was just because they hadn't known about and therefore had failed to stop the abuse. So it just leads into further denial of male power and sexual politics. And survivor became an identity for some women. But she asks, whose purpose is being served by making our wounds central to our identities? It hides male power, it hides sexual politics. And this is a process that's playing out everywhere, all the time. Every time women challenge male power, it provokes a backlash. But in a way, is this the start of the identity politics based on feelings that now crowds out feminist analysis of male domination and oppression? as a social political system based on the material reality of sex. It's interesting, I think, that it may have started so early. And this was a context in the 1980s of a backlash against feminism generally, and a rise of a defence of the traditional family based on male authority. And within this, women's role was actually to socialise and to tame men. So keeping the violence in the home was seen as essential to uphold civilization, i.e., to stop men killing each other. They could take their anger out on their women, which is just sacrificing women and girls. And she has a quotation from Florence Rush. The sexual abuse of female children is a process of education which prepares them to become the wives and mothers of America. So really tackling this would just be too big a blow to patriarchy. And so the men's rights activists and the establishment just circled around and silenced. And so feminist analysis totally replaced with a model in which the victim and not the perpetrator is pathologized. And of course, work with survivors became a cash cow for the psychotherapy industry, just like identifying so-called trans children is a source of money for medical professionals now. She asks, why did women so heartily collude in this deception? And she says it's because victims and survivors of paternal child rape know more surely than many the dangers in challenging paternal authority. So she carries on looking at the parading of survivor stories and the media circus and the proliferation of meaningless treatment programs for both survivors and offenders. But the offender ones were ridiculous nonsense, like measuring penile arousal in response to images of assault, proving that rapists are turned on by rape. And then she focuses very much on the prevention programs and games that were developed for children, telling them the difference between good touch and bad touch, to say no, and suggesting they tell a trusted adult about bad touch. Louise asks, in what sense does that make sense to a child whose father, who she should be able to trust, is her rapist? Girls do say no, and the abuse continues. Who is telling men to say no? This advice ignores that otherwise children are told to obey their parents. It ignores father's power and places responsibility on the child to prevent or stop the abuse. And if you do disclose, you end up in care, and you end up often in certainly in the States. I'm not sure if it happens so much here, but in psychiatric institutions, because the victim has been pathologized. But it gave the appearance of doing something without actually making any real threat to male power. Real prevention would mean changing the way boys become men. The real change would involve attacking male power. But the new incest industry was designed not to challenge men or to hold them to account. So everything just carried on as normal, not lots of talk and very little action. Continuing to hide the reality of the father-daughter rape and keep the focus on a gender-neutral victim and perpetrator. Male violence becomes a public health problem rather than a criminal issue. And it all gets pushed off into family courts rather than criminal courts. And family courts were used to acting on reasonable suspicion of abuse and then removing the child and investigating. They didn't look for proof beyond reasonable doubt like a criminal court was, or innocent until proven guilty. And that was fine as long as social workers and family courts were only intervening with poor women, black women, single mothers. But once this started happening to white middle-class men, they were outraged at their private family life became subject to state scrutiny. This kicked off the real organised male backlash, the organisations of men attacking women that accused them of abuse, claiming of widespread false allegations by women, either adult women about previous abuse or mothers saying that their daughters had been abused. And all this was blamed on coaching by professionals who were determined to find abuse everywhere. This then leads to what she calls the Great Incest Massacre. And she spent a lot of time on this. And there was a lot of this section, which is looking particularly at what happened to mothers who disclosed the abuse of their daughters to the authorities, what actually happened to them and how they were attacked and punished. So mothers who followed the advice of the prevention programs to protect their daughters were subjected by family courts, not even criminal courts, to a modern day witch trial, where of course they would always be guilty. And she gives a several detailed case studies of the appalling treatment of women who would end up in jail rather than hand over a child to an abusive father, would send their children away to live sort of underground, hidden, so that the father couldn't get them. But many actually did end up losing their children to rapist fathers. And so she says it wasn't adult survivors speaking out that threatened the status quo. It was children telling and mothers acting to protect that was really threatening to male power. So this round of sexual politics was hidden away in the private family courts disguised as custody disputes. So women could be brought into line and punished for this without the blaze of publicity. Women were in a catch-22 situation. If they didn't know about the abuse and so did nothing, they'll be found guilty of failure to protect and lose children to foster care. If they did find out about rape and acted to prevent it by leaving and filing for divorce, she will be seen as vindictive and making false allegations. And Louise gives examples of even when there was clear medical evidence of abuse, sperm being found in a child's, girl's vagina after coming back from a visit, children with sexually transmitted diseases, they were still given to the fathers. And she describes this as court-licensed sexual slavery. Because what happened was only the women that met the stereotype of the incest mother, who don't believe the daughter and stand by the man, are seen as believable. Any other women can be dismissed. All agreed it was up to the mother to protect the child, but all the doors slammed on any attempts to get protection. And women didn't realise what they would be coming up against. They lost custody for failing to take a child for psychological evaluation. Other women who did take the child for psychological evaluation said they have an obsession with sexual abuse and lost custody. If they looked calm, they were calculating. But they could not look upset, as that proved they were emotionally disturbed. Judges seemed to be more concerned with protecting a man's reputation than protecting his daughter from rape, were often openly contemptuous of women. And these cases got little media coverage, and when they did, it was easy for the public to assume that if rape had actually taken place, these cases would be in the criminal court, not the family court. It makes it appear like a disagreement between adults rather than about the violation of a child. But our culture finds it easier to frame women as hysterical liars and fathers as sexual abusers. And the next big move against women was the development of so-called parental alienation syndrome. Now, calling something a syndrome makes it sound scientific, but actually there was no actual, research or evidence for this syndrome. It was just based on assumptions and myths that children don't want their fathers punished, that the mother doesn't want to believe the child and wants to keep her husband. All debunked myths. But it meant that mothers were put automatically under suspicion. And it was assumed that women wanted to find abuse, and so they were making something out of nothing, probably because they themselves had been abused, and that made them obsessive and hypervigilant. That women believed that alleging abuse would make a difference in visiting and custody rights, and that they colluded with professionals who were also survivors and wanted to find abuse everywhere. No evidence, any explosion of false allegations, or that allegations of abuse caused men to lose visitation or custody. She'd already said evidence doesn't matter. But because survivors had been pathologised, because survivors of rape were now seen as damaged victims, it made these accusations plausible. It cast doubt on women's sanity, essentially. And so childhood sexual abuse is cause for vengeful gratification in women and a plea of mitigating circumstances for men. Men's behaviour isn't judged in the same way. Their rage is seen as reasonable, righteous indignation, because their circumstances are demanding of remedy. But she gives some examples of actually men in media interviews, and what they said really exposes their entitlement. So the first one said, the newspaper article did not mention that this was a family matter. It sounded as though I had molested some strange 2-year-old baby. And the second one, he said, a lot of times I would turn to my daughter out of anger with my wife. So they were absolutely honest about what was going on, that actually this was just another form of male violence, and often they used the daughters to attack the women, which we still see happening in all sorts of ways. I mean, the most extreme are the cases where men murder their children, better dead than the wife has them. It's just instrumentalizing children. So that to her it shows why women are absolutely right to see father rape or incest as the cradle of sexual politics, and why it has never really been taken seriously as a crime, why women aren't believed, why they're the ones that are punished, and fathers' rights are always put ahead of those of women and children. It's not really seen as wrong, widespread, or harmful. And so it ended up with lawyers and social workers advising women not to raise concerns of abuse because it meant that they would be more likely to lose custody. So the final bit I'm going to look at, I've just got a bit to read here. It says, how much weight are we willing to give children's testimony when it fundamentally challenges the historical rights and privileges of a patriarchal structure, when precisely because the sexual exploitation of children by men has for so long gone uncensured, challenge to this presumed male authority will cause outrage. So the final bit that I'm going to do is what she calls the infantilization of women, or the great incest recovery theme park. So goes back to looking at what's happening with adult survivors and the movement that they're developing based on pain, courage, healing, and empowerment. And it continues to focus on individual needs, not challenging male power, and doing nothing to stop the ongoing rape of girls. It's focusing on an individual's healing. That's the end point, and not political change. She says, somewhere along the way, rather than feminism politicizing the issues of incest as illness had overwhelmed and swallowed feminism. And she calls it the mass infantilization of women, not only survivors of childhood abuse, but all sorts of bad experiences that are a result of being a woman in patriarchy become a need for treatment, for programs, for, making, women are sick, not that we've had a bad time because of men. So no suggestion of political awakening. 12-step programs, which were originally designed for addiction to alcohol and drugs, were sort of used for all sorts of conditions, including survival of sexual abuse. But she shows how the things that those programs focus on are very much about your own character defects, what harm you've done other people, and a kind of personal salvation in a higher power. It's a disease model, but it's just another form of victim blaming. And she says there's an endless swerving from the core issue of male violence against women due to unchecked power by constantly shifting focus. So new issues will be identified, like sexual harassment or date rape, and they're seen as separate from the ongoing old issues of domestic violence and rape, which are just continuing as before. But it hides that it's one continuum of male abuse and control. She recognises that individual women do find solace in therapy. Raising your self-esteem may be beneficial, but it's just benefits you. It does nothing, to reduce father rape. And the adult survivor recovery movement is very disconnected from the war going on in the custody courts about protecting girls from rapists' fathers, which wasn't what happened when feminists set up the first services for survivors of male violence. They wanted to get women to understand that what happened to them wasn't their fault, but due to the operation of male power. But the new therapy industry swamped and starved the male violence against women and girls movement. services became professionalised and staffed by counsellors and social workers who weren't necessarily feminist and were happy with a clinical medical model. And she questions whether women can find any sort of empowerment in a male-dominated sexist society. The feminist principle that the personal is political has shifted to the personal is all, which is just imaginary change. So have the next slide, please. It says, we had hoped that feminism would adopt and strengthen the issue of incest by insistently putting it forward within the larger issues of licensed male violence and working towards change. Instead, feminists, following not their own logic, but their own purloined language, followed almost trance-like, as that language was snatched from them and dangled before them by psychology and therapy. Words like liberation, power, and choice. Instead of survivors being drawn to feminist design solutions, feminists were drawn to solutions designed for the defined pathologies of survivors. This is precisely the brilliance of the therapeutic ideology. By diffusing the political content, it serves the status quo and offends no one. Who can be against healing and recovery? So I'll end that there about the co-option of with the co-option of feminism, which we're still seeing in so many ways, and pass back to Sheila. Thank you.
Thanks, Dorothea. I mean, there is so much in there that's pretty devastating, really, and is a very good description of what took place and why we are in the situation that we're at. Now, what I'm going to do is talk about the final chapters of the book, and I think I'm going to talk about two practices, two things that developed at that time: false memory syndrome and satanic ritual abuse, two inventions of that time, which I think were very important in burying the feminist campaign against incest. They are, I think, particularly shocking chapters. I know everything in the book is shocking, as Dorothea was explaining to us. So I'm going to first of all look at false memory syndrome. Can I have the next slide, please, Jo? So Louise says, by 1992, from the hullabaloo, you would have thought that the sky was falling. That is in terms of the huge fuss that was going on about incest. By 1993, you would have thought the very heavens were tumbling on top of it. She says that there was alarm about false memories of incest, and there was satanic or ritual or cult abuse. They now raged everywhere. And the most spectacular disorder, the issue of incest and severe childhood abuse had so far thrown up. Multiple personality disorder was everywhere. I really remember that. I mean, there were books, women writing books about their multiple personality disorder, as well as, programs in the media and so on. But Louise writes about it as yet another sort of invention that was created to cover over the issue of incest. Multiple personality disorder was much more interesting than talking about actual incest. So can I have the next slide, please, Jo? So was this backlash, she says, all of these things that were going on? And she said, clearly there was evidence that it was. And she talks about a man called Dr. Ralph Underweger, who has been one of the most outspoken about child sexual abuse hysteria. In other words, the child sexual abuse accusations were the invention. And he had been an expert witness for fathers in numerous custody disputes. So he would come on and say that, these were the accusations were inventions. And he was on the advisory board of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And the Foundation's attack was directed at what he saw as feminist therapists for creating false memories. I mean, it really was big, the idea that the memories were created by therapists and that they were about false memory. I remember back in the early 90s, I had an honours student come forward and do a thesis with me on false memories. And I wasn't at all sure at the time that such a thing existed, so it was all a little bit tricky. Now, she talks about this Undervaga man who was doing all this poo-pooing of incest. He did an interview with the Dutch journal Piediker, and this was a journal of paedophilia. Can we have the next slide, please? In his interview, he says that one cause of false memories is radical feminism, which includes a pretty hefty dose of anti-maleness. I think in a very real way, these women may be jealous that males are able to love each other, be comrades, friends, be close, intimate, work cooperatively, function in groups. This would hold true for male bonding and paedophile sex too, so that's probably okay. Paedophile sex. The woman is jealous of the connection. She says, wait a minute, we're not going to let you do that. So women are jealous of men having sex with children, I guess. I believe that women are also violent, cruel, and hostile, possibly more so than men. The radical feminists openly express that side of femaleness against paedophilia. I just noticed that Louise was asking in the chat about false memory syndrome. What is it actually about? Well, what it's said to be is that unhappy women would go to a therapist, supposedly a feminist therapist, because these are the ones being blamed, and the feminist therapist would encourage her to think that her unhappiness was the result of being sexually abused by her father. And she would, under that sort of influence, almost a kind of hypnosis, I guess, recall incidences of abuse by her father. So that's false memory syndrome. And it was a splendid invention because it provided a very good protection for the men who actually did abuse. Can I have the next slide, please, Jo? Louise explains it was 1980 when I first began hearing about women suing or planning to sue their fathers or stepfathers for childhood sexual abuse. So the problem apparently was that when women were encouraged by these feminist therapists to invent sexual abuse, they would then, some of them, actually sue their fathers for the abuse. Now, Louise doesn't say that all of these situations in which women were remembering these things and suing their fathers were false. Absolutely not. She says, but she does say, if we look at the second quote here, it was more than conceivable that some of those appearing in news stories or on television as parents claiming that their children have been programmed with false memories are more than likely correct. So some of the fathers would fight back and say, this is because of false memory syndrome. I never did this. And Louise says that is possible, that actually in some cases the false memories actually were false, but in many cases, of course, they were not. So it was a huge palaver going on about false memory syndrome at the time, and feminists trying to work out what they thought about it, and so on and so on. But it was this challenging of women's probity and this undermining of the fact that women might be telling the truth was very important in undermining the campaign against incest and in the ability to believe women. It was huge. It was really huge. But there was another issue at the time that was very undermining. Can we have the next slide, Jo? This is about satanic ritual abuse. And Louise says that there were a burgeoning number of seminars or trainings being staged at which leaders in the field lent their imprimatur to the credibility of an epidemic of ritual abuse. And that, of course, resulted in multiple personality disorder. Now, what was satanic ritual abuse? It was huge, absolutely huge in the early 90s. It was even happening within feminist communities. I heard feminists who had clearly been sexually abused by their fathers. They were starting to say, and I heard them say to me, that they had actually been the victims of satanic ritual abuse. In satanic ritual abuse, the child is abused by members of the community, often large numbers of members of the community. They might be very important, the local vicar and the local bank manager and so on. In ceremonies, in those ceremonies, they would have to do things like cut the heads off babies and eat them, and just all sorts of absolutely extraordinary abuse. At one point, as Louise says here, one of the adult survivors declared that she had ovaries sewn into her so that she could breed more babies. So what Louise says is that it was a truly epic distraction from humdrum business of ordinary men allowed to molest children in the normal, everyday, routine course of events. Incest, plain and simple, was left behind to eat dust. And I remember thinking this really, really, really clearly in the early 90s. I was really angry because we were just starting to make incest be something serious. And at the time that we do that, suddenly there's this much more media-friendly, terribly exciting thing being invented, which was that there was satanic abuse, ritual abuse, all these horrendous things happening, like horror movies. They were like horror movies. Why would anybody be concerned about an ordinary, everyday attack by a father on her daughter? In that context, was just simply insignificant. I was really, really cross about what was happening, but particularly when I saw that it was being taken seriously by some feminists, and some feminists were involved in the inventing of it, unfortunately. There was a report to government in the UK on satanic ritual abuse, which found that it was extremely unlikely that there was anything that would count as ritual, and there were about 3 incidences of satanic abuse. They were looking at 100 cases, I think. And the report suggested that evangelical churches, particularly in the US, used the idea of this satanic abuse to attack their enemies. Basically, the bodies weren't found. The bodies of all these dead babies and children, for instance, were just never found. It was the most extraordinary hysteria, and I do think that was a hysteria, unfortunately. So can we have the next slide, please, Jo? And yet here we are, being challenged to believe in the existence of a whole satanic pudding, replete with masters of brilliant brainwashing techniques and exquisitely refined organizational skills. And as Louise says, it doesn't challenge gender relations. It's even though it's said to involve ordinary unnamed police chiefs, morticians, etc., because of its conspirational tentacles, satanic ritual abuse does not challenge the traditional family. And also, one would have to ask, where's it gone? I mean, that we don't really hear about that anymore. And also, we don't particularly hear about incest anymore. And I just wanted to take a few moments at the end of this webinar to talk about what's happened to the issue of incest now, because as I said at the beginning, the investigations that happen, what's in the media about child sexual abuse, does not relate to the child sexual abuse in the home and what fathers, stepfathers, male relatives do. You almost never hear about that. You don't see pieces in the newspaper about that, and so on. So, what are you thinking, Dorothea, about where we are today on incest?
I mean, I don't really think we've made that much progress. As you say, it's technically illegal. There's all, and we were talking before we started about the amount of training that teachers and other professionals get to alert them to possible signs, and then they're expected to do something about it. But it is very unclear what actually happens if those concerns are raised, what actually happens to girls, and if they are taken into care. One of the things about the grooming rape gangs that have been exposed in the UK recently is how many of those girls were actually in care, and the abusers would target children's homes to find their victims because these were vulnerable children. So it could be sort of a bit of out of the frying pan into the fire situation for some girls. And the whole parental alienation thing is still happening in courts.
Yeah.
That women are still being accused of that. It was very recently that in the UK, a feminist campaign was successful to stop the presumption of contact with fathers. The courts were working on the basis that it was always right for a child to have contact with their father, even if that father had been convicted, for instance, of domestic abuse of violence against the mother, never mind rape of the child herself. That's only very recently been overturned, and so women aren't going to be forced to take their children to visit abusive men.
Yes, yes, that's right. And I don't think we've made much advance in the chat. Somebody did mention in the chat that we're still not getting very far with language, because there still doesn't seem to be the right language to
Mm.
enable girls to talk about what their fathers and other males in the family are
Mm.
doing. And what I'm concerned about is, yes, we were talking just before in a meeting
Mm.
just before this webinar about how in safeguarding training, there's a good deal about how to recognize whether girls may be being raped. They go suddenly quiet, their grades drop, and so on. But if that's not in the public world, if there's not information about incest out there, if there's not a fuss about it, it is most likely that girls will simply accept what's going on, as they do when they're very young, and their fathers say this is something that fathers always do, and so on. And when they get older, they may not feel the support in being able to do anything
Mm.
about it. There aren't, as far as I know, incest survivors groups anymore that these women can go to and talk with other women. So the problem is, if the information's not out there, how are these women and girls going to be able to recognize the terrible violence that has been done to them? Where will they get the support? Where will they be able to talk about it? Where will the language be to be able to talk about it? I actually feel that even though supposedly school teachers, for instance, will be trained in recognizing whether it's happened, which is not, of course, always going to be the case, how are we going to get the information into the public world
Mm.
so that girls and women can be helped?
I
But
think
I
the
also feel,
prevention
sorry,
campaigns that she talked about, the sort of, good touch, bad touch, and underwear rules and things like that, I think they are still being done in schools with younger children. But whether that's more a kind of stranger danger focus rather than a
as
family focus, I don't
as she
know.
said, and one of the
Mm.
quotes that you used,
Mm.
how is a small child going to be relating that
Yeah.
to their father? Because
Mm.
the father grooms the child. They groom
Mm.
the child through washing them and
Mm.
doing all kinds of behaviors that the child cannot recognize,
Mm.
not
Mm.
acceptable.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't think those campaigns, but I think we need campaigns for the adult women which
Mm.
do not pathologize them, which do not tell them that they are victims. She says the women are made into victims rather than being
Mm.
able to be seen as strong, fight back,
Mm.
and so that's what I would like to see. And of course, the reason we don't see it are all the things that you were saying,
Mm.
which is
It's
huge
too
danger.
challenging. Yeah, it is
Yes.
too challenging to men.
Absolutely. I used to say to my students when I dealt with this issue that obviously in the run up to marriage, marriage isn't very common these days, so I don't know how else you'd get the information out. But in the run up to marriage, women need to be told that the men may rape their children, both their daughters and their sons. And in the old days, the sort of information that was put out for wives, it was only in the psychology textbooks,
Mm.
so the wives would never see it, was you need to watch your husband and watch what kind of kiss he is giving his daughter at the end of the evening when she goes to bed. So the wife has to do all of the looking. But
Mm.
if women are told and trained that they have to assume that the man that they
Mm.
love may sexually abuse their
Mm.
children and
Mm.
learn how to spot the signs. I mean, this could be a little bit of a threat to marriage and
Mm.
relationship.
Mm.
And
Yeah,
this, of course, is why we really can't talk about it. It has
yeah.
to be hidden. I don't
Mm.
want it to be hidden. I would love there to be another campaign, but it has to be hidden. Can you imagine all
Mm.
these earnest women who've just got the new baby in the home, and now they have to start looking at how the husband
Mm.
changes the nappy and
Yeah.
so on.
Mm.
Just
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it could be health visitors. That should be who does it, because health visitors visit new mothers, whether they're married or not. So, as you say, yeah, in
anyway,
our dreams,
in our dreams, but we want at least to bring them the issue back so that women don't
Mm.
feel so alone and don't get
Yeah,
pathologized and so on. It
yeah,
needs to be an important
yeah,
feminist issue. It
yeah.
really does. But anyway,
Mm.
thank you very much
Thank you, Sheila.
for
Thank
doing
you,
that with me,
everybody.
Dorothea.
And yeah.
That was great.